It's a real privilege to have David with us. We haven't met up for a few years, but I've followed his work with real interest. And I'm sure many of you know the many different things he's been involved in. I mean, in terms of managerial, I think you've done 2 stints as head of the Institute in Manchester, haven't you? Yeah. Which is quite a task. I look back on the time I was head of peace studies and think, God, life is so much better now. And I think the thing is that when you're managing particularly a major institute like that, to carry on with your own work effectively is remarkable. This is exactly what David's done. It's going to be really interesting to hear him speak. How long would you like to go on for? We've got plenty of time. We've got about an hour and a quarter.
Well, an hour and a quarter, probably about 35 minutes.
That's a great.
So wait me down at 40 if I have.
All right, I will do if need be. I may not. But I mean, we've got plenty of time for discussion as well, which I think one of the features of this seminar. And as a result, I think we have the prospect of 2 really good days, and I can't think of anybody better to introduce the overall theme of David. So over to David Hulme to present on global governance and the politics of aid in a post-aid world. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, it's a great privilege to be here. It's always lovely to visit colleagues in Bradford, and I feel very privileged to open the conference off. Hopefully what I'm going to do will work out, but I always like my presentations to have a beginning, a middle and an end. And the beginning I was quite happy with, and the middle I'm quite happy with. I think there is an end, but I'm still wondering about it. We'll see how it goes there. The abstract, I think, I did in a hurry quite a few months ago, and that was looking very historical. Actually what I'm going to talk about is probably much more what's happening at the present time and over the last 10, 15 years. And then I suppose the other qualifier I've got, I sort of trespassed into global governance and international relations about 10 years ago. I got fed up of looking at micro-level poverty and thought, let's look at this big picture of global poverty that there's a lot of work on. And that, but I'm always aware when one talks about this that one has these great overviews, but actually there are always excellent people in the room who actually know about the specific countries, people who spent 20 years looking at the World Bank or the IMF. And so please do help me if I've got it wrong, because one tends to put countries or particular cases that fit in with the argument, but people who really actually know that those cases may be able to point out the problems of that. And actually when I started thinking about this, it was a couple of weeks ago. I was in Geneva at the Palais des Nations, and that was a lovely place to visit, but it did really get me to think a little bit historically about this thing called global governance and what we're doing with it. And what hit me actually there was just the sheer almost physicality. And architecture actually meant architecture. This was literally global architecture, and clearly in the 1920s and 30s, against the prospect of fascism and the problems that were arising, still there was a real physical feeling clearly that somehow you could build a magnificent structure which looked over the lake and looked at the mountains, and somehow this would take us forward and conflict would be ended and problems such as poverty and inequality would be overcome. I sort of scratched my head and I thought, well, what is it nowadays? And I thought, well, it's a different world nowadays. Actually, if one looks at it, particularly international development, then it's actually the Sustainable Development Goals. It's not this physical thing nowadays. It is actually lists of 17 goals with 169 targets. I think with potentially 1,000 plus indicators, and somehow I don't know. I haven't found a way out of that, but certainly things have changed, and that sheer physicality, the control, the fact that sort of mankind was just needed to get the architecture right, the conversations right, have now moved on to this much more, I suppose, virtual and this world of lists in which we seem to move. So the Palais helped to start me thinking about the sort of vast canvas, and certainly thinking about the way in which in recent times the actors and the processes have changed so much, and certainly the sort of very big questions that we could ask. And you could see, if you were looking in a way at the pinnacle of global governance, well, in a way the League of Nations has been displaced in New York by the UN and the UN General Assembly, but there is a line of thought that would say, well, no, actually, is the G20 rather slowly, perhaps more slowly than people thought, is that gradually going to supplant the UN General Assembly, a more manageable body apparently, but not representative of all of humanity? So what I was going to do here is explore 1 or 2 key concepts in a way that we've got built into the workshop, identify what I see are key actors and emerging actors and some of the evolving processes. I'm going to argue that we need to get aid into perspective, and I think I gave my paper that sort of post-aid title, but I think aid is now quite small, and hope it becomes even smaller and less significant in our conversations. And those might be conversations about finance for development, those might be conversations about genuine international cooperation, but international cooperation which is not about these relatively small amounts of aid, but about international finance, about the ways in which technology is transferred, about the way the World Trade System operates. I'm going to talk a little bit about whether we can avoid paralysis by analysis, because the thing that hits me when I do actually think about global governance is it sort of does my head in, because I really feel very small. Very small. I'm very tired, and the logical thing, and it worries me when I talk to students about it, the logical thing is to think, well, that's really interesting, but it's just on such a scale and so dynamic and changing that I really can't engage with it. You know, I may understand it a little bit better, but then I just need to go and watch television or drink beer or something. I couldn't possibly engage with how would I change the world, and I think that's something that worries me. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and particularly then talk about whether it's possible to sort of think about the way that one can link practical actions or policy analysis to sort of strategic change, which might be hopefully in the tiniest way possible helping global governance to evolve in slightly more socially progressive ways. A number of biases I think I need to sort of flag early on, because they tend to shape my thinking very much. I come out of a multidisciplinary development studies background, so I'm always very keen to link academic and analytical work to actually policy and practice and say, so what does that mean for what people do? And so I'll do that as part of this. The main country I work in is Bangladesh, but I'm based in the UK, so I tend to see things, if I think of a practical example in terms of what's been happening in Bangladesh, very good news, because infant mortality is down, life expectancy is up, incomes are up in a number of ways, and the UK. I focused on chronic poverty over the 2000s, and I certainly am much better on the poverty than the inequality. My particular focus at the moment, we have an effective states and inclusive development research centre at Manchester, which is a focus on national governance, and in some ways which is challenging the significance of global governance. And I suppose the starting proposition of ESID in some ways is that when development really takes a grip, it's usually something to do with national governance, and that outsiders may be able to help that or hinder it, but that actually it's a national development project that tends to lead to rapid change. And most recently, when I am looking at global governance, I've been looking at the Millennium Development Goals and how the sort of processes around them turning into the Sustainable Development Goals, the negotiations, the bargaining, the new actors who've got involved in that. I think if I was looking at finance or looking at conflict, then there might be a different take on things. I'm just briefly through some of the key concepts, because when I looked at the title that Caroline and Behrooz had sent, I thought I'll have to try and remember what global governance is and how to use it, and cast my mind back to the 1990s when globalization appeared to be the process that everybody had to look at. We're talking about the end of the state and the new forms of governance that were emerging, but I tripped over a number of definitions that I'd scribbled down in my notes. And it was Finkelstein who came up there. You know, global governance is virtually everything. We say governance because we don't really know what to call what is going on. And I think that's probably one of the things to start off with. When people used to look at international organisations back in the 70s and 80s, well, they knew the population, and there was a sort of mappable set of relationships, and you could look at memberships, whereas with global governance nowadays, there are so many different games with so many shifting players operating in so many ways that it is actually extremely hard. It's a little bit like that idea of nailing the jelly to the wall to try and actually get around exactly what you're talking about with global governance. I did, forgot to mention, an excellent book published 4 weeks ago called Global Poverty, The Global Governance of Poverty. When I was doing that, I tried actually to draw a diagram charting the major players, but it just became so vast and so shapeless that, talking it through with colleagues, I said, no, you just can't publish that, it's just such a mess. But it was very hard to try and find a way of actually sort of identifying quite what was happening in some fairly concrete way. So I went back to Tom Weiss, who's a friend at CUNY, and I've sort of used his definition. Global governance should perhaps be seen as a heuristic device to capture and describe the confusing and seemingly ever-accelerating transformation of the international system. So I'm using it in that very broad sense. I'll certainly talk about, well, it certainly needs to recognise the many new actors that are operating, the G20, a whole set of new states that have emerged over the last 15, 20 years, the social movements, the role of NGOs and CSOs since the 1990s, the way the private sector now has to be mentioned in almost all discussions or identifications of key players, sometimes associations of the private sector, sometimes specific corporations, and the fact that we've got increasingly complicated hybrids, whether they're public-private partnerships, but PPPs covers such an array of different types of institution. We've also got changed sort of forms of authority and changed ways in which the public goods that global governance tries to achieve, peace, development or poverty reduction, environmental services, sustainability, a whole set of different processes operating around them, and quite often they're referred to as partnerships, but these partnerships are often tiered, and there are local level partnerships, often national level partnerships, regional partnerships and global partnerships interacting in various ways. So certainly when we look at this thing of global governance, it's hard to pin it down. Aid, I was going to say, is a bit easier, but actually aid has really got screwed up by these processes of global governance. And aid, if you look at what it's usually meant to be, overseas development assistance, the OECD tells us is what we should call it, and it identifies three key characteristics. It's got to be money that's going to low-income or middle-income countries from higher-income countries or middle-income countries. It's got to be primarily intended for developmental purposes, and it's got to have a concessional element, at least a 25% grant element. And the OECD for years has used that to produce the figures that it produces about what's happening with aid and whether aid is up or down and which countries are in and which countries are out. But really that's changed, and we're only beginning to sort of, I think, to get statistics that may have some accuracy on them with the arrival of China and with the arrival of emerging powers. And particularly China, I see, I've taken this term from the RAND Corporation, which has done a lot of work trying to map Chinese finance and that. They say you can't call what China is putting into Africa and Asia aid, and it's best called foreign aid and government-sponsored investment activity, because some of it would definitely fall into the official definitions of aid, but other major parts would not fall into it because they haven't got the concessional element to them. And then a much larger part, particularly when it's tied up with commodities and with access to commodities in the future, it'll depend on the price. And if the contract price the Chinese have agreed to means they're paying a higher price, could happen with oil, the way oil prices have gone, then actually there would appear to be almost an aid element to it. And that if the Chinese actually, the price that's agreed, actually the commodity rises, then actually they'll be getting very low cost access, and it would be a highly profitable commercial interaction. And that certainly means that the things have got complicated, and certainly the RAND Corporation figures talk of $100 to $150 billion a year of Chinese fargia going into Africa and Asia, and try and track that. They claim that 2% of Chinese GNI is actually being used for these purposes. I mean, the other new player on a smaller scale but still significant is philanthrocapitalism, or these mega philanthropists who've come in, particularly the Gates Foundation and the money that Warren Buffett has transferred over. The final thing I've put down there, it's something that I'll keep coming back to, but I really do wonder whether a focus on aid is useful, or whether we should almost always put things into, well, what is the finance that is being looked for at this particular level? And then we fit aid into that discussion, and then we can see whether aid is really significant or aid is not significant. I say that, well, I suppose for two reasons. Partly because theoretically it's a better way of framing how aid fits in, so you're not simply talking about aid, but you're seeing how it fits into that bigger picture. But partly because of my work in Bangladesh. I remain horrified in Bangladesh. Aid has just become tiny in Bangladesh because the economy's grown so much. It's now 2 to 3% of sort of GNI. but I've been working with Bangladeshi colleagues on the National Social Protection Strategy. Almost all the money for old age pensions and child support grants and anti-poverty grants is actually Bangladeshi money nowadays. But I do it through the External Relations Department, and the donors are really important in these discussions. But this is Bangladesh essentially talking about what to do with Bangladeshi money, but still somehow the aid sort of architecture is seen as significant, when really, you know, you ask these players who can give you the odd 100 million or 200 million for advice or a bit of guidance, but they're not really, shouldn't really be a major part of the decision-making process because they're not paying for it. And here I just, I suppose, identify a few of the key changes that we've seen over the last 15 years. Certainly around 15 years ago, around 2000, then donors became development partners, or DPs, no doubt for those of you who sometimes work in this world as I do. I really like to annoy donors still by calling them donors. I find that's really useful in conversations, concrete conversations about projects and that. Development partners, I mean, yeah. Certainly colleagues in Bangladesh will put inverted commas when they say we're talking with our partners, because they still feel that those who bring aid try to dominate the discussions and think they have a right to push decisions forward. And certainly around 2001 gets these important claims that conditionality is of the past and that national ownership is the key, that certainly the tracking of key institutions like the World Bank and IMF showing that it took 10 to 12 years before staff actually, the cultural changes began to occur. When you read in the last few years that certainly IMF staff have thought about what national ownership might mean. And we could ask colleagues in Greece whether they yet quite get the idea about that. The sort of contestation about who actually, I suppose, is the lead player in the global governance, certainly of directing aid and of international development, continues between the sort of Bretton Woods institution, the World Bank and the IMF, still favouring market-led growth, but from a much more central position, they recognise that education, health, social protection, social policies are important. And the other UN agencies, sometimes led by UNDP, but the other UN agencies are not really led. They sort of struggle around and compete with each other. But in general, promoting much more human development agenda. I think that sort of contestation has weakened because in a way both sides have moved towards the centre. The bank says market-led growth with social policies and governance and that, and the UN agencies say human development, but growth is very important and will agree that they want to be part of growth. Two final thoughts about aid. I like Carol Lancaster's work that she did 7 or 8 years ago, which was comparing the UK, Denmark, Japan, and I think Germany, looking at their aid programmes and how they evolved. And certainly what she argued is that domestic politics are very important, domestic civil society is very important in nations that give aid, and that one has evolving mixes of self-interest, but also moral vision. She was optimistic that the moral vision within the domestic politics of aid-giving countries gradually expands. And she said all countries start from a particular position. Usually it's a self-interested position. Usually aid is about achieving foreign policy objectives or about achieving commercial advantage for the country. But that gradually over time, the moral vision tends to become somewhat more significant. But it depends on how much civil society drives things forward. She'd use Denmark as an example where civil society and the church drove things forward, so the moral vision becomes extremely important. She uses Japan as an example where a weak civil society, powerful business interests mean that the moral vision really is still struggling to emerge within society. And then finally, I really like the idea of Hulme Karas, a World Bank economist who's now at the Centre for Global Development. But he's been arguing recently that the whole idea of aid architecture and a new aid architecture is just 20th century, and that in the 21st century isn't actually really elaborated. He's suggesting the idea of an aid ecosystem would be more appropriate, but that in a way this is not hierarchical and they're not clearly structured sort of architecture. There are new players and all players knock onto others and have consequences that may be beneficial or negative for other players, and that we need to have some sort of much more organic rather than a sort of a mechanistic model of what is happening. Let's start where aid tends to start with the OECD's Development Assistance Committee, the old boys club as I call it, and certainly I like to think of it as an old boys club, because certainly when one looks back at the history of the Millennium Development Goals back into the mid-1990s and that, and it was essentially a bunch of aging white males sitting around a table deciding what the global goals would be for the world. When they looked at all these UN conferences, they looked at falling aid budgets and they said, bugger, it's really not much fun being international aid because the money's going down. I did talk to the head of USAID at that time and he said to me, it's awful. I spent 30 years to get to the top of USAID, and what am I doing? I'm just laying people off and cutting it down and reducing budgets. I did this so that I could make the world a better place, so I could have some vision. And all I do is manage the organisation to being smaller and apparently more efficient and more results-based, but I don't think I'm achieving it. But anyway, let's go too much on that. A small club of nations, basically European and with the USA, Canada and Japan thrown in, but mainly European or Commonwealth or North American countries, with Japan as the outlier. And that's changed massively by today, but it's basically by a European expansion. The OECD, in a way the authority on aid statistics, and certainly a major source if you're looking for anything about aid, is still very much based in a way in the world of the 20th century, not in the world that is emerging nowadays. I think almost all of those new players, except South Korea, were basically as we moved to Central and Eastern Europe.
And Turkey.
I'm neglecting Turkey. Wait a second, I dropped Turkey off the list.
3.5 billion.
Okay, yeah, no. I'll have to correct that. And Turkey. We won't forget Turkey. I will find a space for Turkey. If one looks at what's happening, certainly in the sort of the conventional, the traditional donors that are sometimes called today, then sitting in the UK is a rather strange place, because the domestic politics that are happening elsewhere are often the exact opposite of what's happening. Domestic politics in probably the majority of OECD countries mean that there is considerable pressure to reduce aid volumes and to merge aid agencies into foreign affairs ministries, but to not see aid, not give it the volume of money, and not to see, in a way, the achievement of developmental goals as so important. Australia, Canada, Netherlands and New Zealand, all examples of what's happened there. I was in the Netherlands about 18 months ago doing an lecture, and I see one of the political parties there was actually beyond UKIP. It was campaigning for a 0.0 aid policy, but that aid should be 0.0. That's our target. And certainly among some of the white working class in the Netherlands, that might have sounded like an attractive aid target, given the problems that the domestic problems that people felt they were facing. So the mood in much of the OECD is actually that aid has grown too much, has got out of perspective. But a whole set of different arguments on that. Some are charity begins at home. Some actually argue, well, it can't be used effectively. Those people in Africa and Asia are corrupt, they waste the money, so there's no point in us giving it them. And so some people say, well, we'd give it if we could, but it's a waste of time because it can't be used well. When one looks at the way in which aid is being shaped, then certainly a major focus on poverty and the Millennium Development Goals, I suppose they did achieve a consensus against extreme poverty, in a way a lowest common denominator goal, that poverty should be the priority focus of aid programs. A focus on aid effectiveness, which for many countries means that you get results-based management, and that there is a real focus upon metrics of measuring the outcomes more complex processes, but very short timescales with whatever data you can get hold of. And particularly in many countries, but the UK certainly taking the lead in this, the idea of value for money, that you can actually look at the comparative costs and benefits of what you're doing, and that it's possible to identify value for money. This does reach quite crazy stages. I did bump into someone who I thought had an impossible job, but she managed, I think, to get away with it because her career is developing. But she was doing work for DFID in Bangladesh, doing a value for monitoring assessment of the social empowerment and accountability programs that DFID had in the country. There were thousands of them with women's groups and public interest litigation lawyers and all sorts of groups, and this idea that you could somehow seriously look at the value for money of all of these different things, which are all looking for social change on medium to longer term basis. Anyway, she obviously produced a good report on it in that way. And finally, what I put down here is something which I think has certainly happened in the aid world and spread into the whole idea of international development. This lie of the science of international development, but this belief in random control trials, that there is a science out there that will actually tell politicians what to do, and that politicians can can hide behind this. They can absolve themselves of responsibility because working with what works is a sort of expression that we do what works, and apparently there is this objective scientific evidence. You don't need theory or ideology. You don't need to understand the way the world is changing. You just look at the data from the recent past, and that will tell you exactly what to do, and then you do more of that. In a way, this sort of belief in a decontextualised development in which the local or the national just don't count, and that's certainly become, I think, a significant part of the aid discourse. When one gets, trying to remember the previous Conservative minister, the one who cycled and said the words he shouldn't have said. And that, I mean, when he used to promise the British people that you'll get £100 pence worth of impact for every pound we spend, that this is just a vending machine. We just know what we're doing. Just trust us. It just delivers growth. It delivers reduced infant mortality. It empowers women, and that sort of science and international development is certainly something which the domestic politics in the rich world has promoted. Very nice for people who do random control trials. Universities are full of them at the moment. Strangely and contrary to that, then, Caroline and Will can talk more about this, but many donors have also become interested in political economic analysis and have been saying that we want to fine-tune what we're doing in developing countries by better understanding what's happening in the country. But actually, if you look at those political economic analyses, certainly the agencies and the politicians who may be looking at them keep those separate from their citizens. If you look at something like, for 7 or 8 years, the UK government had drivers of change studies done, looking at the political economy of the major countries it was putting money into. The ministers only mentioned drivers of change twice in public, and very few of the studies went public because it wasn't something that you could share with the British public. Because essentially what the drivers of change studies said is that development is an extremely complicated process, and we don't really understand what's happening, and we can't proceed with certainty, and definitely nothing is predictable in this game. And so whilst in a way that knowledge was seen as valuable, that was not to be part of a democratic process, because it would have undermined the case for maintaining and increasing the aid budget. But we still get David Cameron talking about the golden thread that all good things come together. You sort of get growth, and you sort of get human development, and you get democracy, and they all come together. Francis Fukuyama's challenging that. Certainly talking about sequencing, you need state capacity before you need the democratic accountability. And certainly, I think the Asamoah and Robinson work would just suggest there are multiple paths. The way in which development emerges, the political economies, do seem to vary greatly and do tend to depend very much on the domestic roots. But a sort of pessimistic picture overarching that, but then the 2 points I make at the bottom is that in the UK the domestic politics are different at the moment. The UK has decided it wants to be global cheerleader. Nobody's particularly saying it should be, but the UK is very keen to be seen to punch above its weight, to be seen as more influential in this field, and probably it's looking at the political economy of a waning imperial power that would help us understand some of these things, and some of the micro-politics of the late 1990s, the operations of Claire Short and the way that she somehow changed helped to change the opinion of political parties and of maybe British civil society about aid and about development. South Korea keen to become a cheerleader too through the Busan process and leads of that sort, but it's still, I think, bottom of the commitment to development index. So it's not putting its money or its policy where its mouth is on aid. Let's move to the new kids on the block then, the BRICS or the BRICS or the BICS. I've put down these things. Jim O'Neill originally wrote about the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India and China. Work that we've done at Manchester looking at international development and the emerging powers, we were interested in the BICS because we just couldn't locate Russia. And you can wonder whether Russia maybe should be part of your investment portfolio if you're a global investor, but if you're looking at processes of international development, then it's not highly active, but we might want to think about that. But now the BRICS have evolved into the BRICS, and South Africa is the big S at the end. It's really important to note those differences, because in the way the BRICS would operate may be different than the way the BRICS with the big S would operate. In a way, for a long time, the narrative was they're coming, they're coming, they're coming. But in 2014, they did arrive. And we've got the new development bank and the contingency reserve arrangement. Essentially, an alternative World Bank and an alternative IMF set up. And certainly one vice president of the World Bank described the meeting at Porto Alegre after the Football World Cup as the new Bretton Woods. Whether it will be, I think one could wonder about, but he certainly, in flowing terms, talked about the way that you look back in 50 years and see this as the moment at which global finance for development change. That moment came about certainly because China and other parts of the BRICS just are not prepared to accept the US Congress go slow or go nowhere approach to World Bank and IMF reform. And there was a period of certainly 10 or 12 years when serious reform of the World Bank and the IMF could perhaps have led to those remaining, in a way, the global institutions for development finance and for stabilising national economic financial problems. But the go slow process in the US has certainly made that something the Chinese are not prepared to continue. But one needs to notice some of the, in a way, changes that occur because of the BRICS with a small s turning into the BRICS with a big S. And certainly the politics of sort of international inclusivity required that there was an African player. You couldn't seriously claim that you were setting up a new global financial institution which would operate differently but would be fair and socially just if you didn't have an African player. And the African player was South Africa, so the S became bigger. And at the present time, that looks like it will weaken these new global financial institutions because the South African economy can only make a relatively small contribution. And if you're going for equal contributions of capital for each of these 5 players, then the new development bank and the contingency reserve arrangement will be on a relatively modest scale. Not small, but they certainly won't be as big as they could be if you didn't have to try and accommodate what the South African economy can afford. And finally, I've put down the casual acronym empowers Russia, but fortunately Jim O'Neill, who invented the BRICS term, is from the Manchester region and is now a professor at the university. And talking with him a few months ago about the sort of new development bank and the CRA, and saying, well, you know, what about Russia in these? And he said, well, in a way, it's confusing that they're part of these new institutions, but it does give them potentially a new tool, in a way, yeah, to play their particular interests out, and they may be able to get, in a way, more purchase than they would have been by being able to be part of these new and sort of competing global arrangements. It may give them new ways of challenging the US or annoying US presidents, which certainly with Putin seems to be something. When we look at the emerging powers themselves individually, then China is giving group leadership. You have to also note that it's got, the foreign aid and government-sponsored investment is on a mega scale. Indian colleague told me he'd been working out recently and was looking in the next few years at potentially $30 billion of investment in Indian infrastructure, something that would transform the infrastructure blockage that one has in India at the moment. That's not through the BRICS, that's simply through Chinese investment. We've got the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which potentially is certainly challenging the Asian Development Bank. And if you look at the politics, there's led to crosswords between Obama and Cameron. But Britain has joined that, and the US sees that as weakening the US position in debates about what happens in global finance and international development and aid. As I've moved down here, then I've become, I'm hoping people will educate me in that. India I see as a dozing giant, and a dozy giant. I work in India quite a lot, not particularly on these issues, but I find Indians are very cross with the fact that they're not seen as a big player. But it's partly because they have next to no diplomats overseas, and these diplomats are not actually very dynamic people. They don't really function well at the United Nations. And so yeah, India could be a bigger player, but somehow some of the nature of the Indian bureaucracy almost stops it from being able to articulate things. And there is also just a focus on Pakistan within Indian policy. Brazil has been much more strategic. You've got public and private investment and strategies. But I think if one were looking at that seriously, one would be trying to think about how Brazil is fitting into the emerging sort of Latino ideas, alternatives, intelligentsia. And certainly I perceive over the last 10 years that a sort of Latino intelligentsia is now a major part of discussions about aid and international development. Often trained with PhDs in economics in the USA, but working across and able to play the technical games, but also very adept at understanding the political economy of development. Russia, I've said, we don't care whatever you want to put in there. Hopefully somebody here will know a bit more and be able to actually explain to me perhaps over coffee how we would fit Russia into this, but it's very hard to track down any engagement in them. I think we need to move beyond the BRICS, and the project that we ran at Manchester 3 or 4 years ago looked at what we call beyond the BRICS, and that was looking at the emerging middle powers. And we felt that the idea of the emerging middle powers is a really good idea. Sometimes, Goldman Sachs are calling them the mints, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, Turkey. There was the next 11 concept. But we think if one's looking at it academically, then it probably is a group of emerging middle powers that one wants to look at. One doesn't necessarily want one of these acronyms which global investors obviously need. But if one does look at the mints, then certainly our analysis suggested that Mexico is interested, but is shackled by its relationship with the USA and its engagement with NAFTA, and it's very hard to see an alternative position coming out of Mexico. It's got quite a lot of domestic governance problems too. Indonesia, probably neglected certainly in the UK and Europe, maybe by the US, by academics and politicians. There's 260 million people in a fast-growing part of the world. Clearly merits a lot of attention. Nigeria, I think it needs a great act of the imagination to imagine Nigeria taking on a global role in this. The domestic political problems are enormous at the moment, and I think it was a brave attempt by Goldman Sachs to find an alternative to South Africa. But one would have to have a great act of the imagination to see Nigeria being able to engage at more than the regional level. Turkey, which I think we're going to hear about more today and tomorrow, then actively pursuing international development. The government, with its expanding aid program moving to Central Asia and Africa, business certainly well connected with the aid program as far as I can see. Turkish business seems to be doing quite nicely after the Turkish aid program from what I've seen of it. And in addition, if you look at the World Bank figures, if you look at the engineering companies and companies that are winning large contracts for international aid agencies, then Turkey has gone up and up the list over the last 10, 15 years, and quite a, I can't remember, it's 5 or 6, but it's a major player in terms of actually winning the big contracts that come out of international aid. And then you've got civil society, the Gulen movement, and things which I'm sure other people could explain to us because they are quite complicated. Finally, I've put down the Arab states, but they are a blank in my thinking, but when I was looking through the aid figures, then UAE became the world leading donor last year, 1.25% of GNI, and largely with supporting Egypt. And certainly if you're looking at the politics of aid, this is not the United Arab Emirates suddenly deciding that they're concerned about the ultra-poor in Egypt. It is a quite different set of political games. Civil society, certainly one of the other big players now, I mean, emerging since the 1990s, but social movements, CSOs, and NGOs heavily engaged in these processes. It's sort of a confession, because I still find it difficult to think of global civil society, actually. I did 3 books with Mike Edwards in the early 1990s when we were very much aware of the growing role of NGOs. But when we got to global citizen action, I stepped down and John Gaventa edited that one, because I just couldn't quite get my head around global civil society. And I still struggle to quite work out what it is. So I struggle on with it. Done some recent writing to upset Duncan Green and colleagues at Oxfam with Nikki Banks and Mike Edwards, and we've been revisiting some of the arguments. But certainly when I look, not in a systematic way, I can explain the methodology in a minute, but when I look at what NGOs are doing in the Sustainable Development Goals and the shift from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals, then I think they've become wonderful global lobbyists. And when you look at Beyond 2015, Brussels-based, the southern partners in it tell me that it's dominated by the northern partners. The northern partners in it tell me that it's equally balanced on it. But it's very effective lobbyists at the UN, part of most of the major meeting, the processes that are going on today in New York, and that participate this group of 25 civil society organisations from the south that have come together, that managed out of IDS at Sussex and paid for entirely by Department for International Development. I think they've become really good lobbyists. They do really good PowerPoints. They find the killer facts. They do all that sort of stuff. But I think they've been much less effective, perhaps very ineffective, at social mobilisation. And the one that's really tried this is the Global Coalition to Assist the Poorest, which was operating back in the 2000s and trying to get momentum behind the millennium. But certainly the work that's been done by Clive Gabay and colleagues at Queen Mary University in London indicates that certainly in many aid-dependent African countries, then the Global Coalition essentially looks at the UNDP office and takes policy from what UNDP or groups of donors are indicating they will pay for. The methodology I've used for this is actually whenever I bump into, which I do quite regularly, the heads of major NGOs, I say, you people are very good at lobbying about the SDGs, but you're not connecting the SDGs and the debates to church groups, to women's groups, to civil society. And I've never had one tell me I'm wrong. None of them have ever actually said, yes, we are. Bond, I see, have just started off an initiative, but rather belatedly, to try and get British NGOs to work out how they'll, in a way, introduce the British population to the Sustainable Development Goals. But I do feel that somehow much of the argument has been captured. And certainly, when I look at the excellent stuff that Beyond 2015 do, it's very much in the donor game. It's the bullet points, it's the killer facts, it's the graph, it's playing that role. It's not the messy mobilisation of voice and bringing new social forms forward in that way. If I talk about these things with my old colleague Michael Edwards, then Mike's he says, it's the aid stupid. Once you've got aid, you've got donor-recipient relationships, and those relationships are just downwards. You don't actually have any proper social relationship. It's always dominated. You have all this dancing around, and you talk about partnerships, and you talk about joint agreements and all sorts of things, but essentially the public accountability processes and other processes that come with aid mean that you cannot have in any way a balanced relationship. Mega philanthropists, I've been going for 40 minutes, I better move it. We've got
half enough.
Okay, well that'll be obviously the mega philanthropists or philanthrocapitalists are another important change in international development in addition to global governance. The Gates Foundation with its $42 billion is clearly a substantial volume in terms of aid. Though interestingly, if you look at it in terms of finance for development, then actually it doesn't look like a particularly substantially large sum, certainly once you annualise it. At one level you can welcome these new resources, but there are great concerns about undue influence and the types of influence. And I've just sort of got two illustrations down here. One was with the Minister of Health in Uganda. I took a group of students there 3 years ago, and luckily we got half an hour. At the end, in the brilliant way that students do, the student asked a question which really got to the heart of things. The student sort of said, so, can you tell us about the future of health policy in Uganda? And so it was, well, I'm only the Minister of Health. You need to ask Bill Gates if you want to know about health policy in Uganda, because the Gates Foundation is putting in a lot of money. The Gates are incredibly influential, so the other donors, I mean, it's a very powerful analytical machine. It really has the data and the arguments. So in a way, you come in around that, and it's very technological, it's vertical provisioning is the way that will achieve the targets quickly. And so very quickly, the whole of the health aid budget is about a Gates type of approach of vertical program delivery. And it's almost impossible for a Minister of Health, even for someone like Museveni, to actually probably negotiate against that, to argue that no, we'd like health service delivery across the country through a different approach. You can also look at the sort of approach of the new philanthropists. Business methods are emphasised, and the metrics, and certainly again, my colleague Michael Edwards has written quite a lot about the way that this focus on measurement and metrics means that empowerment and social transformation, these sorts of vaguer socio-political goals get lost because you can't get good metrics on them, so why would you waste your time if you can't get good metrics on them? I mean, a greater concern, I think, has to be about the justification for global inequality that is provided by this, and I find this particularly the case if I talk in the USA, where people will say, well, it's okay that people make mega billions because then they give that mega billions back to the poor. And that depends on whether you see individuals directing that or whether you see states and negotiations between states as the way to deploy those sorts of resources. And so global charity becomes redistribution. And the final thing I've put down there is about, there is this global development celebrity elite that my colleague Dan Brockington's written about. Certainly Bono, Clinton, Gates, Mo Ibrahim, Joly, and sometimes others. At one level you can say this is great because they get poverty and development and aid into the media, which doesn't usually get interested in those sorts of things. But certainly, if you look at Dan Brockington's work and Colin Crouch's idea of post-development, post-democratic societies, then you can argue that this is actually trivialising things. It's not getting people to engage with poverty in other countries or engage with inequality. It's very much sort of saying, well, we've got these icons that are taking care of it, so I don't need to worry about how I vote. I don't need to worry about what's happening. I can just leave it up to these icons. Business in the private sector always has to be mentioned, often in the background, but obviously the question one would ask is whether this is the puppet master hidden behind the stage. I mean, virtually all documents and all statements nowadays say that the private sector is essential, it's essential for growth, and then sometimes jobs is added on, increasingly jobs is being added on, because the growth will deliver argument has certainly been challenged in major ways. You could make that in the 2000s, but in the 2010s, it's got to be the right forms of growth. You can't simply say growth will deliver. Private sector involved as a direct player in public-private partnerships and new sorts of arrangements, as a charitable player through corporate social responsibility and that. But interestingly, look closely, I think the UN Global Compact, which Kofi Annan, John Ruggie in 2000 regarded as almost as important as the Millennium Declaration, the Millennium Development Goals, seems to have stalled or faded away. I think it only has an income of about $3.5 million a year. It's really a very small club for 5,000 or 6,000 private sector operations. New forms of operation, I think Bono has got this red credit card, which actually tells you that the more you spend on wealthy luxury goods, the more you spend on Gucci, then the more money goes to poor people. So if you just increase your consumption of luxury goods, then babies will stop dying for want of medicines in the developing world. I think Stefano Ponte and Lisa Ritchie writing about the way this supports a sort of capitalism as usual project and promotes inequality in that way. I'll skip the Barclays example. What does it all mean? Well, it's the opening paper, so the answers will become clearer tomorrow afternoon, perhaps, on that. Analytically, I mean, certainly it points just to the complexity and the speed of change and how challenging it is to come up with with I think, grand narratives that can try and grapple around all of these things. If I was looking for something, then I would have thrown myself back into trying to read and understand Robert Cox and see whether he could help me out of it. But we let people who have read Robert Cox much more closely talk about that. I find emotionally it's quite interesting, because actually, if you look at it, there are grounds for optimism in that global governance is no longer dominated by the global north. There are a much broader set of conversations. China and India, African countries, are now having opinions in places where it would have been unimaginable 15 or 20 years ago. Many global indicators are very positive. Growth, human development, even violence. Most of Asia, most of Africa, then today's the best day to be born, because your projected life expectancy and your income are probably looking better than at any time in human history. Certainly low-income countries have more choices about finance and policy. And if you talk to departments of finance, ministries of finance in low-income Africa, they'll say we now have choice. We didn't have choice 10 years ago. We just did what we were told. But you could be pessimistic. Inequality is rising. Is this business as usual capitalism? We haven't had capitalism. Reform through global governance. The collapse almost of the system in 2008 hasn't led to major changes. And certainly some colleagues will say to me, well, you're assuming this opening up through China in particular is good, but maybe it's just Chinese self-interest will replace US self-interest. Will that really change things? I've moved on quickly to what does it mean for academics. I think there's a real danger of paralysis through analysis if you really try to get your head around global governance. And when I look at what we should do, I think the point I've made already, we should avoid a focus on aid and try increasingly to make sure that aid is subsumed within finance for development or international cooperation. And I think we need to be looking for ways to ensure that sort of the analytical work helps to identify practical and operational work that is contributing to progressive strategic change. And particularly for academics, we can promote particular ideas. What does that mean? Two brief examples to finish off with. One of them is actually my own work. It was a paper I did called as Microfinance, What's Its Moral Compass. I gave up on microfinance about 10 years ago, but I still can't help reading about it. But a damaging moment last year when I realised the things that are really worrying me about microfinance in Bangladesh and India at the moment, the increasingly abusive clients and the very assertive behaviours of field staff, pushing indebtedness onto people, the type of collapse that occurred in Andhra Pradesh with the microfinance market 2019. It's actually part of a much broader loss of moral compass by the financial sector. And actually when you look at what's happened in South Asia, where microfinance started off with social goals, then it's been sucked in to the macro-financial scene. The institutes are rewarded by their performance. Their performance is repayments on time, essentially, low repayment rates. And financial indicators drive what is happening. The social indicators they used to have been marginalised. And I think that was a useful contribution to the South Asian debate, but it also helps us to actually frame the sorts of ideas. And certainly this finance, which is driven by short-term financial goal achievement, is damaging things in poor countries as much as it's damaged us in the Western North America. Final example is one who some people, many people probably don't like. It's by Ravalian and Chen. Martin Ravalian is the man who invented $1 a day, $1.25 a day, which certainly people like Thomas Pogue and many other people will say was the sort of minimal poverty line that you could come up with. It ensured that you could put the minimum amount of effort into reducing poverty around the world. It should have been $2 or $2.50. But if you take his measure, then that red line, that's what you get for 1990 to 2008, but it continues on down. And it's basically that absolute poverty in the developing world is reducing. Development systems of global governance apparently are giving us a massive reduction. What he's done in 2013 is divided it into what he calls a truly global poverty measure, which is fitting extreme poverty, the sort of concept of extreme poverty, together with the idea of inequality through relative poverty. And he's woven those together. And what you get from this is that the true global poverty rate has actually dropped very slowly. Why has it dropped very slowly? Well, it's actually because if you look at relative poverty in the developing world, it's increased dramatically in China and India. Because the people who've escaped extreme poverty are not on some progressive path. They've just got over the line and are trapped in very low-paid employment and insecure employment. But interestingly, it also includes the high-income countries, and this is mainly Europe and North America. that relative poverty in Europe and North America has actually increased. So actually the rich world is contributing to relatively slow rates of truly global poverty rates. And I use this as an example again of the way that those of us who are working as academics can try and find ideas that might actually be able, might be operational, you could use them actually for planning policy, but they also help to fit ideas such as inequality, ideas such as the problems that neoliberal finance is causing into specific policy decisions. So we've got a grand canvas over the next 2 days. I think we need to get aid into perspective. It's only a small part of the process. I call it post-aid, but maybe finance for development or international cooperation. I'm worried about this paralysis through analysis trap. At Manchester, many of my colleagues seem to get into really elegant critiques of neoliberalism, but it leaves students paralysed. They just cannot see what they might do, that they could make the world different in any way. And I think we need to craft analyses that promote the ideas that have both practical and strategic value. Thank you.